Hello, so let's look at Kantian ethics. And as we'll see, Kant's ethics stands in stark contrast to many other ethical theories, in particular consequentialist ethical theories that tell us that we should strive to produce the greatest good for the greatest number, or for some good that is the consequence or result of our action. Kant's ethics, in fact, falls under a general category known as non-consequentialism. And what that simply means is a non-consequentialist ethic would be an ethical theory that says the moral value of an action is not determined by the consequences. It has to be determined by something else. Now, Kant was of the opinion that when we decide to make certain decisions, whether this is telling a lie or it's stealing or it's an act of, charity, we can know in any given instance what our intentions are, and we can know, therefore, whether what we're doing is right or wrong, regardless of what the consequences happen to be at a given time. And Kant will say that really our motive or our intention is the thing that counts. It's not really the fruit or the result of our actions. To think about this, you could think about this notion that he talks about called the good will. And to get us started thinking about that, take an example from Kant's own work where he thinks of two shopkeepers, two grocers, one of whom decides that he will be honest with his customers. He won't cheat them. He won't, give them incorrect change. He won't give them bad products. But he only does this because he thinks if he were to do it and he were to get caught, this would actually be bad for business. In other words, if word got out that he was a dishonest shopkeeper, then people would stop patronizing his shop and he would lose money. By contrast, we could think of another grocer, another shopkeeper, who says, well, I'm going to be honest with my customers, even though I could take advantage of them in some cases and actually benefit myself perhaps a great deal. Maybe I won't be caught doing it, but the point is I know it's wrong. I shouldn't contemplate actually treating them unfairly. I shouldn't commit some fraud or lie to them or steal from them. Clearly, in these two cases, says Kant, we have different motives for being honest or for being forthright with our customers. In the first case, Kant says, a person may not be breaking any laws, but a person has no moral worth because he is only doing the right thing because it's self-serving. He's not doing it because he recognizes that it's the right thing and he should do it regardless of what the consequences to him happen to be. Put another way, Kant will say that the only time that we have a sense of moral rectitude or moral worthiness in our own person is when we perform our duty simply for the sake of our duty. We do the right thing because it is the right thing to do, not because it will maximize our happiness, not because it will benefit society, not because it will benefit us. Now, Kant's ethics, broadly speaking, falls under a branch of ethical theory called deontological ethics. This comes from the Greek word deontos, meaning duty. So as we'll see in what follows, Kant is going to talk a lot about different duties that we have to perform, or in some cases not perform, certain types of action. Kant's ethics, as we'll see, are also absolutist. That is to say, many of the duties that Kant is going to talk about are going to admit of absolutely no exceptions whatsoever. So to take probably the most famous case, Kant once famously said, one must never lie. And emphasis should be placed on the word never there. In other words, he drew a line in the sand, so to speak, and said there is an absolute restriction on doing certain kinds of actions, in this case lying. Now, how do we go about determining whether or not our intentions, because we said our intentions are what really matter for Kant, not the consequences. How do we know whether our intentions are actually morally good? How do we know that we're actually doing our duty? Well, in order to see that, we have to first understand what Kant means by rational agency. You and I are rational agents, whereas for Kant, animals would not be. But perhaps, Marvin the Martian or Mr. Spock or maybe, an intelligent android like Data from Star Trek The Next Generation might qualify as rational agents by some definition. What's involved by talking when we talk about being a rational agent? Well, Kant would say that to be rational, we make sense of our lives by applying various kinds of rules to guide our behavior. A simple example of this would be when we decide to go through a yellow light rather than stopping before it immediately turns red. There's, implied in our behavior, there's some kind of rule. The rule might be some implicit rule like, the last 10 times I went through a yellow light, I didn't get a ticket, I wasn't caught in the red, I didn't get into an accident, so I know that it's safe to go through the red light under these circumstances. That's not to say that when we engage in such behavior that we're always explicitly aware of what rules we happen to be following will be, but the fact is we do follow some kind of rule or some kind of script in various aspects of our behavior. We can explain our behavior, that is, by some application of some rational rule. Now, Kant will say that there are basically two types of rules that guide our behavior as rational agents. One is what he calls a hypothetical imperative, and the other is a categorical imperative. Now, as it turns out, the categorical imperative will be far more important for moral theory. But in order to know what the categorical imperative is, it's helpful to know what he means by a hypothetical imperative. So let's look at that. So a hypothetical imperative works something like this. It tells us what to do if we have certain desires. So an imperative is a kind of command. But the imperative here is a hypothetical. It tells us that we should do X, but only if we want to obtain certain things. It's dependent, it's hypothetical on our desires, on our wants. So one example might be, if you want to lose weight, you should eat less, right? Or if you want to earn a better grade, you should not miss any assignments. Now, these are obviously two kinds of rules that we might use to guide our behavior. But notice, even though this is a kind of rational command or a reasonable bit of advice that does apply to us, it only applies to us hypothetically. That is to say, these rules will only apply to a person if they have certain desires. In the first case, what if I were to say, well, I don't need to lose weight, or I don't care about losing weight? Well, then, obviously, the claim that I should eat less doesn't really apply to me, does it? And let's say that I'm not a student in your class, or I'm not I don't really care about getting a better grade. Or maybe I already have an A, and I think I can't get a better grade than an A, so it doesn't matter if I miss, the occasional assignment if I still know I will get an A. So in those two cases, obviously, the should statement there that follows from the if statement in each case only applies if the if applies, if I want to lose weight, if I want a better grade. Now, Kant will call these practical or sometimes prudential imperatives, prudential uses of reason. These are not really moral applications of reason, but they guide our practical behavior. Now, by contrast, the categorical imperative is a moral imperative. So let's see how that's supposed to work. By the term categorical, Kant simply means something like universal. It's something that doesn't apply to us because we have certain desires, or because we're male or female, or because we're old or young, but it applies to everybody in the same way insofar as they are rational moral agents. The term imperative, as I mentioned before, simply means a command. Now, a categorical imperative will tell us not what we should do if we want to obtain some given end, but it tells us what we're obligated to do regardless of what our desires, regardless of what our ends happen to be. Now, Kant sometimes talks about this in terms of a distinction between duty and inclination. Now, each of us, in various cases, will recognize that sometimes we know what the right thing we ought to do happens to be in a particular case. But we also find that we don't really want to do it. In other words, our duty, our moral duty, is in conflict with what we're inclined to do, what we want to do. So, as one example, stealing is wrong. And we can recognize that stealing is wrong, and we'll look at one argument that Kant might give to justify that in a little while. But let's just assume for the sake of argument that we agree. Stealing is wrong. And it doesn't really matter who we are or what we look like. Stealing is stealing. But wait a second, though. What if I really want something? I mean, aren't there cases where, maybe you want a car and you can't afford it. Maybe you want a sandwich and you can't afford that. Maybe you want to go on a trip, and it'd be great if you could get somebody else to pay for it. The only problem is they don't want to pay for it. They want to pay for their trip, not your trip. So it might be really convenient for you or me to want to steal something from somebody, but we recognize that as hard as it can be to keep our inclinations in check and do the right thing, doing the right thing is not necessarily what we want to do or are most inclined to do. So keep that sort of distinction in mind as we proceed. Now, CI, what I'm abbreviating the categorical imperative as, expresses what Kant calls the moral law, which is an objective law of morality, which he says is written on the hearts of all rational beings, all beings like you and me. So, in point of contrast to, say, a relativist who says there are no objective moral truths, but there are only relative moral truths. Kant is a moral objectivist. So Kant is going to say, for example, that stealing is wrong or that lying is wrong. And that's not just an opinion, but that he's going to try to justify those claims with an argument. Okay, in the next lecture, we're going to look at how the categorical imperative breaks down into different formulations. And then we're going to apply those in particular cases to see how it is supposed to generate different duties.